Today's guest on A Life and a Living podcast is Dan Norenberg. Now, Dan, as he will explain, is from the USA, but is based in Munich and has been for quite a number of years. He's a consultant and a real expert in the leadership space. And he's written a really first-class book, a really first-class book called Executive Ownershift, which, as you can see, I have marked and done all sorts of things with it and scribbled on if you looked inside it. But it really is an excellent book about leadership, and it's about leadership teams and the importance of getting the culture in the team right. I said many books focus on the leader himself or herself, but this book actually talks about the importance of getting the team right and understanding what is it actually that makes up a successful team. He talks about the cornerstones of the executive ownershift, and he explains what he means by ownershift fully. So, and it really is important to actually understand what are the bases of that. But we also talk about how you assess, as he refers to his significant six, what are the things that you assess the effectiveness of a leadership by, and it's really interesting when you listen to him talk about that. And it's all about creating that culture of ownership and ownershift in the business. So I really recommend you listen to Dan. He's an expert in his space, and it's a great interview. And certainly I would highly recommend his book as well. So sit back and listen to Dan Norenberg. Dan, thank you so much indeed for joining me this morning on A Life and Living podcast. It's a great honor to have you here.
Well, John, I would say that the pleasure is mine to share time and experiences with you is time well spent. So thanks for the invitation and looking forward to the conversation today.
This would be good. I want to talk to you about the book that you've written, Executive Ownership, which, as you can see, I've got thumb marked, tags, all sorts of things. If I opened it up, you'd see all the pages that I've highlighted. So I love the book, which is my way, because to me, that's always the litmus test for me. If I really enjoyed the book, I go look back and see how many tags, written notes, I scribble on books. That's why I like, for business, I like hard copies. So maybe just tell a little bit about yourself and what led you to kind of write the book, Executive Ownership.
Yeah, well, maybe just a little bit about my background. I mean, as you can hear, I'm American or North American, but I'm from the middle part of the United States. I studied psychology and criminology, and with an ambition to go to law school and change the criminal justice system of the United States. That was my ideal. But I thought at the time it would be helpful to get maybe a little bit of business experience, because with a psychology background, I didn't really do much business, and I thought that might be important in law. So I went to California for 1 year and ended up in a place that I guess now is referred to as Silicon Valley, and ended up in some sales and marketing positions for some high-tech, high-growth companies. And it really tripped my trigger. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed working on the marketing side, the sales side, and working with customers and helping people resolve their issues. And I completely forgot about law school and spent about 10 years in California, which I just absolutely adored and had wonderful jobs and wonderful bosses. And when the company that I was with went out of business, it was just a technology before its time, I decided to go to Europe for a short period of time. So I packed up my backpack. I was in my early 30s and headed off to Europe for 9 days. And many friends warned me that 9 days probably wasn't going to be enough time, and went through Paris and Geneva and got through Munich, and the 9 days were up, and extended the trip a little bit. And to make a long story short, instead of returning back to California to resume my career, I decided to put my feet down in Europe. And I thought I'd stay for another 6 weeks, and now 30 years later, I'm still here. So imagine now an American guy who's, in Munich. This is 30 years ago. So I didn't speak a word of German. I didn't know a single person, and I didn't have any work papers. But I learned pretty quickly that in order to stay, if I set myself up as an independent business person, that I could extend and become actually legal in Germany. And that's when I got into the sort of coaching, training, development. I had a strong business background, strong communication skills, negotiation. And after a short time, bumped into some people from the Siemens group, a very large German organization. And they brought me in to be part of their intercultural management team and to work with their executive development team. Did that for 3 years. They offered me a full-time job. But at that point, I thought, well, there must be some life outside of Siemens, as much as I did respect and appreciate the work there, and set up my own training and development company. called Envision Learning Solutions. So we were a learning boutique focusing on communication, collaboration, and leadership topics. Worked with about 25,000 people in 26 countries in 25 years. And it was during that time, so it's a little bit of a long windup, but it was during that time, I was the founder, I was the owner of that company. And it was during that time we were doing talent management, primarily across Europe, but a little bit in Asia and North America. And from time to time, the vice president of human resources or the executive assistant to the CEO's office would visit me after one of my workshops and say, Dan, you know, we've heard about the work you're doing in the talent, at the talent level here. We've got some issues in the executive team, and we wondered if you might be able to give us a hand. And I was, you know, flattered and said, well, I'd be very happy to see if I can support you there. And said, I'd be happy to. How do we go ahead? And either the man or woman would kind of gently put their hand on my elbow and say, well, don't get your hopes up too high. They've already worked with 3 consultants this year. So, you know, let's see how this goes. I said, well, let's just see how it goes. And so long story short is I started to enter into, so my entrance into the executive suite was not, you know, through a McKinsey angle or Deloitte or a business school. It was, you know, through the streets, you know, working the bottom up and getting in there. And what I realized when I stepped into these executive and strategic leadership teams, what I saw was a huge amount of intellectual firepower, really smart people and ambitious people, and people who had a lot of knowledge about the business and that wanted to be successful. But it wasn't too difficult to see that by standing back and just watching how these men and women work together. They didn't really work together as a team. They didn't communicate effectively. They didn't support each other in achieving their goals. And that became sort of the foundation. That was about 15 years ago that I started at that executive level. And then over a period of time, I've now worked with over 100 executive and strategic leadership teams. And this book is a consolidation of my experiences, the tools that I've seen, the tools that I've used, the experiences. So sometimes there'll be a case study, sometimes there'll be a tool that I'll introduce that you mentioned that you like to couple in there. And sometimes I'll take maybe a lesson learned and wrap it into a metaphor or story, which I think are good ways to remember things going forward in the future.
Okay. And so explain ownershift, because it's an interesting word. Explain what you mean by that, because sorry, 2 things. One is that. Second one is what I I always think that the world probably needs another book on leadership, like, you know, a hole in the head, because there's so many out there. But what I loved about your book was that it was actually about the leadership team as opposed to the kind of, if you like, the principles of the leader, or about the leader.
Yeah.
So talk to me about why you actually went down that angle, and also what you actually mean by ownership.
Yeah, well, there's a couple things. So my approach, I would say, is unique and different from a couple different perspectives. Is that individual leadership capabilities are important, but they're not game changers. And the game changer in today's business, the complexity, the speed, the diversity in today's organizations, it's too much for one individual. This concept of an individual heroic leader that, you know, sort of has taken us through the last 500 years is not really relevant for today. This doesn't mean that individual leadership is not important, and it isn't about forming a collective organization or a type of socialist team. This isn't the concept, but the idea is that a leadership team that's really functioning at its highest level, where all the members, you know, feel ownership and identity of that team, are going to outperform a team with a singular leader time and time again. And I think this is the next big thing in leadership development. So, and the other thing is that this idea of an individual leader and the development that we do around individual leadership, which is important. Individual coaching, individual development, talent programs are very good. So we can improve, let's say, leadership performance. But what we can do, and let me put it this way, what we can do when we work with leadership teams is that we can develop leadership competence and develop leaders' performance, and we can also increase and improve organizational results, because there's no individual contribution, regardless of how extraordinary or how significant, that translates into an organizational result without going through a leadership team. Yeah. So my premise is that we can still do development. We can still develop people, and teams can learn to help develop each other, as well as drive really important business topics. So that's a little bit about why it's a team concept and why I do that. And the idea with with ownership, it's maybe there's a little story around that, and let's see if this is fitting. But yeah, and you might be familiar with it. It's about a guy goes into a small hotel, and he checks into the hotel, and the clerk checks him in, and the guy looks over and he sees a small, cute little dog sitting in the corner. The guy walks over and he looks at the dog. He looks at the clerk, and he said to the clerk, "Does your dog bite?" And the clerk says no. And the guy reaches down to give the dog a pet, and the little dog just about takes the guy's hand off. And the guy pulls his hand back. He's absolutely exasperated. He said, "I thought you said your dog didn't bite." And the clerk says, "He's not my dog." Now, we all, sometimes we've seen that story in a little bit different context, but what's the essence of that story? The essence of that story in a leadership context is that the clerk, was responsible for the job. He checked the guest in. We might even say he was accountable for things like petty cash and things like that. But he didn't take ownership for the customer experience, because if he'd really owned the customer experience, he'd never let that man reach down and almost have his hand taken off by the dog. Yeah. And we see this in leadership teams. We see this in leadership teams with dedicated, hardworking people where they say, "Well, that's not my function. That's not my job."
Yeah, and I think it's really, because one of the stats that I thought was really interesting stat, I hadn't come across it before, was you say in the book where 80% of executives believe that they have the skills to perform their role, but only 30% believe that their colleagues had.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of scary on one level. But the other part to that you added in was, and they don't see it as their job to do anything about it.
Yeah.
Which is coming back to the point that you're making, that, okay, so I might see my colleague, and whether, I don't see it as my job to actually develop my colleague or support or grow my colleague. Whereas in a high-performing team, I would see that.
In an executive team, at the highest level, where we set the example for everybody else in the organization, if I'm not helping my colleagues be successful, who is? And what kind of message am I then transmitting to the rest of the organization? Yeah. We all just become a lot of individualist performers with a slight mask around these things. So this ownership, begins in the executive team. I've got to own that. I've got to own my role in the team. And a lot of my work, John, probably yours too, is, I spend a lot of time observing. I'm asked to observe an executive meeting or a strategic review meeting, and I just sit in the back of the room with a fly in the wall, and folks ask me to come in, and then I share, depending upon how much time I have, 30 to 45 minutes of insights about what I've seen. And, a common thing that we'll see sometimes, or maybe, somebody's interrupting somebody in a meeting, maybe a board member, or not even the CEO, just somebody in the senior leadership team is interrupting somebody else. And I'll say, "Well, did anybody see, Harriet interrupt Pierre during that meeting?" Well, yeah, that's her style. That's her style. Oh, why didn't anybody say anything? Well, that's the CEO's job. No, it's not the CEO's job. I mean, that's the CEO is the leader of that team. He or she has to monitor that, but we all have to take accountability and make that ownership. And when we do, not only does the leadership team get better, but it cascades out into the organization and creates a sort of epidemic of ownership through ownership, if you will, that I'm very excited about.
Yeah, and you talk about, which I thought was really powerful to reflect about it, the cornerstones of executive ownership. Can you maybe talk about those kind of 4 cornerstones that you talk about in the book? Because I think that's really helpful in terms of actually people understanding what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, I think it's sometimes when I'm talking to people about the work that I do with leadership teams, somebody might say, "Well, gee, these executives, they don't want to go out and do a kumbaya, hand-holding, team building, or build a bridge out of wood, or we don't want to go start a campfire together." And I just and I asked them, "So, what is your impression of building a highly effective team? Let me share my viewpoint. How I operation define executive ownership." And this is a transformational growth process that really has 4 anchors. Number 1, it's to ensure that the senior leadership teams in any organization, that they operate at their best practices. Their purpose, their unique contribution, their meeting culture. Things of that nature. Second of all, it's to be able to create and to communicate a sensible strategy, a strategy that people not only is intellectually clear, but it's emotionally compelling. So that's the second part. The third is to be able to, through these practices, develop a culture which is really engaging in an ownership culture where people feel that they want to bring their best a little bit more. And last but not least, it's all anchored in ensuring that the customer is the center of everything they do, which is really the currency for an ownership culture.
Yeah. Can I talk a bit just on that? Because I think that those cornerstones are really helpful. But you used a term there called senseful strategy, which I really, really like, because when I started working, which was kind of 100 years ago, when we talk about strategy was kind of this huge, big piece of work, right? That you went away up to a darkened cave, and all of you sat there and contemplated what it might be, and you came out and you got a tome that you created as a consequence of that. Now, as it happens, you put that tome in a filing cabinet, you probably didn't look at it again. But strategy is now becoming much more, for want of a better term, agile, isn't it? In the sense that it's got to be, so it's not this big process. It's much more about clarity, that people get engaged with it, that get excited by it, and it actually points the way.
Well, yeah, you said something at the beginning which sort of triggered a wonderful conversation that I remember from my mother. You said at the beginning that you enjoyed my book, which I'm really flattered, because you're top in your field. And when you say you've marked it and tattered it and dog-eared it and put mark, and I've seen that, so I know that. And you've talked about some very specific parts to me about the book, so I know you've really been into it. And my mother said, that's how a Bible ought to be. She said, and my mother was quite religious, and her father was religious, and so she said, a Bible shouldn't be something that's all polished and that you keep in the top drawer and things like that. It should be look like it's part of a living playbook in a journal, and that's how a strategy should be too. A strategy should be something that you should work on, and I think probably about 12 or 13 years ago, the shift started to take place. It used to be that this whole strategic dialogue, strategic work was about putting together huge decks of slides, and it became a huge monumental piece of work that then after the presentation and people had signed off on it, it was placed in the top drawer. And so one of my first questions is, let me see a copy of your strategy. Show me if I'm visiting it could be head of supply chain, head of sales, head of marketing, or CEO. Like, where do you keep your strategy? It's like, well, first of all, that turns into a 5-minute exercise or a circus, because people say, well, this is a second, maybe somebody can find that for me. They don't even know where it is. So strategy should be something that really guides our everyday actions. And it's a part of the leadership team work that doesn't have to be a 6-month or 6 weeks. It can be something that you can really move forward in 6 days. Naturally, if you need some market research on, market segments, that's another thing. But the problem is today is that strategy is still seen as an event versus a process. And even after we've orchestrated sort of the main song sheets of a strategy, the work doesn't stop there. That's where it starts, and that's where the sensible strategy process comes in, about making sure it's clear, making sure people feel connected, making sure they understand what is the contribution, what are the collaboration points that absolutely have to work for the strategy to be successful, and what are the consequences? I mean, positive when it works and negative when it doesn't work.
Yeah. When you talk about the leadership team, and there was one part, and I mentioned it before we started, that I really loved and have actually used it with a couple of people, was what you call the assessment of the leadership team, which is you talk about your significant 6.
Yeah.
And I thought that they're really powerful questions to ask, and to ask a team to respond to, and to talk about and discuss, because I think they can maybe just kind of quickly go through what those 6 are, because I think they're great questions.
Yeah. Well, the significant 6, it's basically, it's the whole premise, the final premise, or the final of the significant 6 is this leadership team working at its best, playing at its best? Is it? And what I'll often get is, well, we're pretty good. And then I'll start to drill down a little bit, and I'll ask, how do the behaviors in the leadership team contribute to excellent performance in the organization? How does collaboration, the leadership team show up in an excellent way in the organization? Is this leadership team meeting the best meeting in the business? If so, why or why not? And in what ways do we work in the executive team to ensure that the strategy is really, understood, clear, and connected? So these are questions you can start to bore down on. And when you ask those questions, people say, like, actually, Dan, we're really not playing at our best. And the analogy that I try to use to make it simple for people, I'll ask a leadership team, and you can even maybe even your listeners want to ask this. If you're being honest with yourself, have you ever run a red light? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we'd all raise our hand and say, at some point we've all run a red light. Yeah. But we would never run a red light if we knew there was a young mother and a baby in a buggy crossing the street on the other side of that red light, because the consequences would be too significant. And the significant 6 is a way to drill down and help us understand what are the consequences of not playing at our best or running a red light. And so I find it's sort of a game opener, let's say, for leadership teams that are sort of hunkered down into their executive isolation.
Well, I think it gives it's a great series of questions to ask to really kind of dig into how the team is performing. And I thought that was really powerful.
Thank you.
From your experience, Dan, what do you see as kind of the big impediments to building that high performing team?
Well, if you ask me, I think I refer to this in chapter 8 or chapter 9 about what are, some of my experiences. This isn't for everybody, and in early in my career, I mean, I let me just say this first of all. I believe that leadership is everything to the success of a company, and it starts with leadership teams. That's both the executive team and the strategic teams that report to them. However, you've got to believe that. So if you don't want to accept that responsibility, if you don't want to take ownership for that, that's going to be an impediment. So a leader that refuses to admit any sort of vulnerability or admit that they could possibly be wrong, maybe you've ever witnessed a leader who thought they got everything right, and we can see the results of that. So I think vulnerability.
There might have been a leader at you who just finished his term yesterday.
Well, there's probably a lot of leaders out there that are afraid to, admit their vulnerability. But vulnerability is not a sign of weakness; it's a sign of strength. So I think that if there isn't a respectful exchange in a leadership team, that's one thing. If people feel they're in the leadership team as a matter of elitism, or that they deserve to be there and that everybody else should change, then it's probably not going to work. But the really pinnacle point is, the thing for me is that when I look to work at any team, and that could be the executive team, or it could be a strategic team or organization, the key factor is, to what degree does the senior leader, does he or she recognize that they have room to grow, and they're willing to grow, and they're willing to share how they want to grow. That becomes the catalyst. Then we can really move mountains with that.
Yeah. And how do you go about creating that culture of ownership in the team and in the business? How do you actually go about doing it? So somebody comes in, they've taken on the role, this is the direction they want to go, and maybe that's not the way the organization or the team has operated in the past. How do you go about creating that shift?
Yeah. Well, I'm a firm believer that people give their best when they have a chance to make a choice. Choice and being voluntary, being able to step into things is what really drives people. I can't force people down this road. I'm very good at what I do, but people have to make their own choices about ownership. So I have some techniques that work really well in the first stage of the consulting process. So in the diagnosis phase. So, let's say for example, after meeting with a senior leader and he or she expressing an interest to work with me and help take the team to a new level of performance, I would then invest quite a bit of time speaking with each member of the leadership team and letting them get to know me and me getting to know them in a confidential interview process, or it's more of a conversation, not an interview, where I ask them about, what's working well in the team, what's not working so well, what's the one thing the senior leader could do that would enable them to be more successful, what does success look like at some point in the future. And I take these conversations, that's usually a team of maybe 6 to 12 people. Recently there was a team of 16, that was more of an executive committee. And then I'll take those comments and I'll make sure that they're anonymized, and I'll put them in a document which I call a perception consolidation. And then I'll go back and meet with the senior leader, and the senior leader will get a chance to look at that, and she can look at that and say, well, yeah, that's clear. Oh, that surprises me. It's not an empirical value, it's just a collection of conversations, which I've segmented into different categories. And then with the leader's permission, which is always the case, we introduce that on the first morning, the first afternoon, or first evening of our working session. And the people get a chance to see those comments of how they describe the current situation, what their aspirations are for the future. So if you will, that is almost like oil in the ownership process. People see that, and then we go through what we call an agenda building process, where they select the topics that they feel are most important to their future success, both for the team and the business. So that's sort of how I do it. Okay.
I want to talk about, just for a few minutes, talk about meetings, because I loved I come across before, the Milton Berle was a committee. It's a group that keeps minutes and loses hours, and God knows that's so true, isn't it?
Yeah.
But at the meetings, and people are always going to do too many meetings. But having said that, meetings are kind of the fuel that keeps everything going, because you create your strategy, you create your vision, you create your plan, and your meetings are really should be the kind of the vehicle by which you're actually keeping track and having conversations about variance, all that sort of stuff. Why do so many meetings go so badly?
Well, let me answer this way. If I were to, in a slightly different way, if I were to, come over to France right now, which I'm looking forward to when we come out of this lockdown, and I were to take a pin prick and to prick your finger, just to prick your finger and just get a little sample of blood. If we were medically capable, we could learn so much about your medical history, or my medical history for that matter, by one single drop of blood. By one single drop of blood, we could see so many predictive elements about your longevity, your health, your past, your future, your current strengths and weaknesses, let's say physically, from one drop of blood. And that's the analogy I would use with a meeting. A meeting, particularly at the executive level or strategic level, is like a microscopic blood sample. And I can tell you, what happens in the leadership meeting is what happens in the business. So, and maybe this is a little bit of my background. My father was in the sergeant in the U.S. Marines and the Korean War veteran, and so I never served the military service. But I can tell you what it's like growing up in a house when your father is the former football coach of the local team, the high school principal, and an artillery sergeant. It was, so you really learned the.
Yeah, I kind of get in a picture of this. Yeah,
well, you learned he was like a sort of an Iowa version of Vince Lombardi. He was a very famous football coach in the past. But what I learned from my father is the importance of fundamentals. And if you look at any top chess player, orchestra, sports player, tennis, cricket, football, basketball, every season, regardless of how many tens of hundreds of millions they make, they always go back to fundamentals. And running a good meeting is a fundamental component of the business. So meetings go awry, or meetings don't go well. It's because people forget how important they are, And we think it's something like tying a shoe. I mean, would you think about going out on the soccer pitch without tying your shoes? Of course not. It's a simple little thing. But if you don't tie your shoes, you're probably going to lose a shoe. You won't have the traction. So by observing leadership meetings, which I said is probably a significant part of my business, I can tell a lot about execution and commitment and how people communicate, the degree of respectful. And there's also, I don't know if you picked up on this, but there's a great tool in that meetings chapter, which is really drives continuous improvement in meetings in the business.
Yeah, it's a great tool and a great template. I must say, it really is good. Dan, this has been fascinating, and I'd love to come back and maybe do another one, because there's a load of stuff that we haven't got on.
Yeah, you're a wonderful host too. You're a wonderful host. It's just really easy to talk to you, and I'm really grateful for the questions, because you've provoked my thinking as well.
Oh, well, that's great. Before we wrap up, two questions I ask everyone. One, a book other than your own that's had an impact upon you. What book would that come to mind, and what impact did it have?
Yeah, that's a question that almost takes my breath away, because I think libraries are sacred places, and
absolutely. Well, I've seen the bookshelves behind you. I'm sure there's plenty more. Yeah.
Well, this is just my bookshelf in the office. This is even the bookshelf at home. So I just love smelling books and being around. But I think I'm going to cheat a little bit. I don't think I can't do one, John, but I can say that one of the mainstays with which you're all obviously quite familiar with is Viktor Frankl's book.
Yeah,
A Man's Search for Meaning. That's such a powerful book that I go back to time and time again. And so that's one. And also I read recently, it's not a new book, but I read recently a book by Dave Mitchie. I don't know, he's an English guy, and he wrote Buddhism for Busy People. And he's a former business executive that talks about how he got into Buddhism and how it helped him put his life together. And I found that extremely pragmatic. And the last one I do is, what is it, Professor Pouch, the last lecture.
Yeah,
that's about 10 or 12 years old, where a man saw, was either fortunate or unfortunate enough to see that the end of his life was coming very quickly, and he didn't run away from that. He ran into that and left not only his family and his colleagues, but even people like me, some powerful thoughts about how to carry my life forward in the future.
Yeah, they're great. They're three great books. I mean, the Viktor Frankl one is.
Yeah.
I mean, I try and go back and read it every year. I wouldn't say that I actually hit that every year, but I would certainly go back at least once every 18 months. Yeah. And every time you read it, you get something different. Yeah, and I think it's just one of those extraordinary books. Daily rituals. I'm always fascinated interviewing successful people about what their daily rituals are, because they all seem to have them. They're different, but they have daily rituals. And what are yours, and what do they do for you?
Well, the secret, I think the secret to it, I think daily rituals are really important, because that's how you sort of set the programming patterns, for the day. But the secret to a daily ritual is that it doesn't begin in the morning. It begins the night before. So, both my wife and I are very, very conscious about how we close the day. And so, closing the day means, moving out of the either work sphere or the private sphere, into the bedroom where there aren't any devices. There's no TVs, there's no phones, there's no radios, there's no clocks. And, we live in Munich, the center of Germany, which, gets cold in the winter. But I can tell you, the windows and the sliding door are open. So you walk in there, you think like you're in an igloo. I don't know, this is maybe some thing of my wife, but so the room is quite cold, and then we sleep, and then that's how the morning ritual starts for me, is by letting go of things, making things simple, avoiding distractions, and getting a good night's sleep. I can't say enough about that. And then the morning, I would say for me, it's I wake up rather early. I'm usually up about an hour before my wife, so that's about 5:30, and she gets up about 6:30. And I make a conscious effort to just to fill my mind with positive thoughts, being grateful and being thankful for what I have. I mean, we're all going through some sort of discomfort. I mean, we just recently had COVID ourselves, but I know that a lot of people have had a lot worse, or living in a lot tighter spaces than us. So try to work up with a feeling of gratefulness. I enjoy a good cup of coffee in the morning, and either a ritual or a tick. I have to make the bed within the first 60 minutes of getting up. So when my wife gets up, she's German, but she's not the bed maker. I'm the bed maker in the house. And that's really an important sort of closure for me. And then it's about 35 minutes of exercises. So I do a stretching routine, an ab routine, set of headstands, with some different configurations of that to keep me loose. And if the weather's nice, I ride my bike to work. So I live on the west side of Munich, and my office is between the Nymphenburg Castle and the English Garden, which is a lovely area. So I've got a 45-minute bike ride in the morning. And if not, then I usually try to walk a part of the way to work after getting off the train or something like that. So that's my
great rituals. Fantastic rituals. I really love that. I love the night before piece, because that's an added thing. I love that. That's really, really good. Dan, this has been fantastic. Where can people get in touch with you? I mean, we put it all in the show notes, but if they're listening, where can they get in touch with you? Where can they get your book? Well, I know it's on Amazon, but where else can they get it?
It's on Amazon and Hugendubel and Barnes & Noble, a number of places. But if you go to my website, which is www.dannorenberg, it's all one word, Dan Norenberg, and .com, you'll see a place, depending on what country we're in, where you can order the book, number one. I'm very open to, let's say, virtual dialogues or exchanges on LinkedIn. So I'm on LinkedIn, and I'll post usually once or twice a week, so people can catch me there. Or if people are interested in not only my book or learning about, some of what I try to do on a monthly basis, to share some of my experiences working with clients in an anonymous way in a monthly communique called News to Use. So if you go to my website, you can sign up for this. It's a newsletter. It comes, and I try to provide some pragmatic tips about life and leadership and running high-performance teams.
Dan, that was fantastic. It'll all be there. It's been fantastic. I loved it. I'm sorry I took up more of your time than I said I would, but I appreciate you staying with me on that. and I'd love to come back and do another one. But in the meantime, Dan, thank you so much for being a guest today.
You're welcome, John. Thank you, and stay safe and be happy.